The interview was going exactly the way late show interviews with Tom Hanks always went. Warm, easy, filled with the kind of laughter that comes from two people who genuinely enjoy each other's company. Tom sat in the guest chair with that effortless charm he'd perfected over 40 years, telling stories about his grandchildren, about the new film, about the absurdity of fame and the strange blessing of getting to pretend for a living. The audience adored him. Stephen adored him. Everyone adored Tom Hanks because Tom Hanks had spent his entire career being exactly the person everyone needed him to be. Decent, kind, the embodiment of goodness in a world that sometimes felt short on it. They were 20 minutes into the conversation when Stephen asked the question that changed everything. "Tom," Stephen said, leaning back slightly in his chair, "you've played fathers in so many films. Forrest Gump, Road to Perdition, Extremely Loud and Incredibly Close. And you've talked before about how important fatherhood is to you in your real life, but I've never heard you talk much about your own father. Tell me about him." The shift in Tom's expression was immediate, not dramatic but unmistakable. The warmth didn't disappear entirely, but something else arrived alongside it, something heavier, something that had been waiting a very long time for permission to exist. "My father," Tom said quietly. He looked down at his hands for a moment. When he looked back up, his eyes were different. "My father was a complicated man." Stephen leaned forward slightly. The room had shifted. Everyone felt it. "His name was Amos," Tom continued. "Amos Mefford Hanks. He worked as a cook, itinerant cook, moving from job to job, restaurant to restaurant. He was married 4 times, had 5 kids scattered across those marriages, and he did his best, I think, or at least he did what he was capable of doing." Tom paused, his hands, which had been resting casually on the armrest, tightened slightly. "I didn't grow up with him," Tom said. "My parents divorced when I was 5. My mother got custody of me and my siblings, and my father, he drifted. He'd come around sometimes, take us for a weekend, buy us ice cream, try to be dad for 48 hours before disappearing again for months." The studio was quiet now. This wasn't the Tom Hanks America was used to. This was something rawer, something real. "I spent my whole childhood," Tom said, his voice dropping lower, trying to figure out who he was, trying to understand why he couldn't just stay, why being our father wasn't enough to make him want to be present. "And I convinced myself that it was something about us, something about me. That if I was better, smarter, funnier, more interesting, maybe he'd want to stick around." Stephen didn't move, didn't interrupt, just held the space. "And then I grew up," Tom said. "I became an actor, I became successful, I became famous, and I thought maybe now he'd be proud, maybe now I'd be worth staying for." His voice broke slightly on the last word. "He came to the premiere of Splash," Tom said. "My first real hit. I was 28 years old and I'd finally made it, and I saw him in the crowd afterward. He was standing there in a suit he'd borrowed from someone, looking uncomfortable and out of place. And I went up to him and I said, 'Dad, what did you think?' And you know what he said." Tom looked directly at Stephen now. Tears were forming in his eyes. "He said, 'It was good, Tommy, real good, but I gotta get going, I got work in the morning.'" The first tear fell. "He stayed for 20 minutes, Tom said. 20 minutes at the premiere of the movie that changed my life, and then he left, and I didn't see him again for 2 years. Subscribe and leave a comment, because what Tom reveals next will break your heart." Stephen's own eyes were wet now. He reached up and took off his glasses, set them carefully on the desk. "Tom," Stephen said gently, "when did he pass?" 1992, Tom said. "I was 36, I'd won my first Oscar by then. I was one of the biggest movie stars in the world, and he was dying of kidney failure in a hospital in Alameda. And I flew there, I dropped everything and I flew there because I thought, this is it. This is my last chance to hear him say he's proud of me, to hear him say that I mattered, that I was enough." He stopped, wiped his face with the back of his hand. "And I sat by his bed," Tom continued, his voice shaking now. "And I held his hand, and I said, 'Dad, I need to know something, I need to know if you're proud of me, if any of it was worth anything to you.' And he looked at me with these eyes that were already half gone, and he said..." Tom's voice broke completely. "He said, 'Tommy, I've always been proud of you. From the day you were born, you were always enough. I was just never enough for you.'" The silence in the studio was absolute. "And then he died," Tom said. 6 hours later he died, and those were the last words he ever said to me. I was never enough for you." Tears were streaming down Tom's face now, down Stephen's face, down the faces of 300 people in the audience who had come to see a comedy show and were witnessing something sacred instead. "And I've carried that for 32 years, Tom said. "I've carried the guilt of it because he was right. I spent my whole life thinking he wasn't enough for me, thinking that if he just tried harder, loved harder, stayed longer, then maybe he'd be the father I needed. But the truth is, I never gave him permission to be who he was. I never accepted that his version of love was the only version he had to give." He looked directly at the camera now, tears still falling. "He wasn't a bad man," Tom said. "He was just a broken man, a man who grew up without a father himself and had no idea how to be one. A man who worked 3 jobs to send child support checks that I never knew about until I was an adult. A man who kept every single article ever written about me in a scrapbook that I found after he died. Every review, every interview, every mention of my name. He kept them all, and he never told me." Tom's voice was barely above a whisper now. "He loved me the only way he knew how," Tom said. "And I spent 40 years wishing he loved me differently. And by the time I understood that his love was enough, that it was always enough, he was gone. And I never got to tell him I'm sorry. I never got to tell him that he was enough, that he was always enough." Stephen stood up from behind his desk. He didn't announce it, didn't perform it. He simply stood because sitting felt wrong. He walked around the desk and sat on the edge of it, close to Tom. "Tom," Stephen said, his voice thick with emotion, "can I tell you something?" Tom nodded, not trusting his voice. "Your father knew," Stephen said. "The scrapbook proves it. The fact that he came to that premiere at all proves it. He knew you loved him. He just didn't know how to receive it because nobody ever taught him what that looked like, but he knew." Tom shook his head. "But I never said it, I never told him." "You lived it," Stephen interrupted gently. "Every film you've ever made where you played a father, you were trying to understand him. Every character you've ever created who struggled to be present, to be good enough, to be worthy of love, that was you trying to figure out how to forgive him. You've been telling him you love him for 30 years, through your work, through your life, through the man you became in spite of the pain he caused and because of the love he gave." The two men looked at each other, both fathers, both sons, both carrying the weight of complicated love. "I have something I've never told anyone," Tom said suddenly, "something I've carried alone for 32 years. Stephen waited. "The night before my father died," Tom said, "when I was sitting in that hospital room, I fell asleep in the chair next to his bed, and I had a dream. In the dream I was 5 years old again and my father was young and healthy, and he picked me up and held me, and he said, 'Tommy, I'm sorry I wasn't what you needed, but I gave you everything I had and I hope someday that's enough.'" Tom's voice broke. "And I woke up," he said, "and my father was awake too, and he was looking at me, and I swear to God, Stephen, he had tears in his eyes, and he couldn't speak anymore by that point. The kidney failure had taken that. But he reached out his hand and he touched my face just once, just for a second, and then he closed his eyes and he never opened them again." He paused. "And I've spent 32 years wondering if that dream was real. If somehow in those last hours we found each other. If somehow he heard what I needed to hear and I felt what I needed to feel. And I'll never know for sure, but I choose to believe it was real. I choose to believe that in that moment we both said everything we'd been too afraid to say for 40 years. Stephen wiped his own eyes. When he spoke, his voice was gentle but certain. He said, "I lost my father when I was 10, and I've spent my entire life trying to make him laugh from a stage he'll never sit in. And what I've learned is that we never stop being our father's sons. We never stop seeking their approval, their love, their forgiveness. But maybe the point isn't to get it from them. Maybe the point is to learn to give it to ourselves, to forgive ourselves for not being perfect children, to accept that the love we received, however imperfect, was real, was enough." He paused. "Your father left you a scrapbook," Stephen continued. "That scrapbook is him saying, 'I saw you, I was proud of you, you were always enough.' You don't need to carry the guilt anymore, Tom, you can let it go." Tom looked at Stephen with an expression of such raw gratitude that it transcended words. "How?" Tom asked simply. "How do I let it go?" "You already are," Stephen said. "Right now, by telling this story, by letting 300 people and millions watching at home witness your pain, by choosing to believe that love doesn't have to be perfect to be real, you're letting it go." Tom nodded slowly. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a worn photograph, held it up so Stephen could see. It was a picture of a young man in a white cook's uniform smiling at the camera. On the back in faded ink were the words, "For Tommy, love always, Dad." "I found this in the scrapbook," Tom said. "It's the only picture he ever gave me, the only thing he ever wrote to me directly, and I carry it everywhere, because even though he's gone, even though I'll never get to have the conversation I wanted to have, I have this. I have proof that he loved me, and maybe that has to be enough." He looked at the photograph for a long moment, then carefully put it back in his pocket. You know what the hardest part is? Tom asked, looking back at Stephen. It's not the anger or the sadness or the guilt, it's the acceptance. Accepting that my father was human, flawed and broken and doing his best with tools he didn't have. Accepting that I'm human too, that I wasn't the perfect son any more than he was the perfect father. Accepting that love doesn't fix everything, but it's still the only thing that matters. Stephen nodded. That's not the hardest part, Tom, that's the bravest part. The applause that followed didn't start immediately. It started slowly, quietly building like a wave, not performance applause, the kind that comes from deep recognition. From people who understood what it cost to stand in front of strangers and admit that you spent a lifetime getting it wrong, that you loved imperfectly and were loved imperfectly, and that you're still learning to be okay with that. Tom Hanks wiped his face, straightened his shoulders, and for the first time in the entire conversation he smiled, a real smile, small and fragile and completely genuine. Thank you, he said to Stephen, for letting me say that. I didn't know I needed to until I started talking. That's what this is for, Stephen said, not the jokes, not the promotion, the real stuff, the stuff that matters. Tom looked out at the audience, at 300 faces, many of them wet, all of them completely present. If your father is still alive, Tom said, and you're carrying something you need to say to him, say it. Don't wait until it's too late. Don't spend 30 years wishing you'd been brave enough to be honest. And if your father is gone like mine is, like Stephen's is, then find a way to forgive him. Forgive yourself, choose to believe that the love was real even if it wasn't perfect, because perfect love doesn't exist, but real love does, and real love is always enough. That night, laughter gave way to grace. And television remembered its soul.